Wish you were one of those influencers with raving fans who binge on your every word, consume all your content, buy everything you have to sell, and demand even more? Then stay tuned while Authority Magazine columnist and BuzzFeed contributor Tracy Hazzard shares strategies, tips, and tactics from top videocasters, podcasters, authors, and social influencers on creating that bingeable factor. Now, let's join Tracy as she explores how to rise above all the digital noise with the binge factor.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Binge Factor. I'm Tracy Hazzard, and I have an extreme podcaster today. I have Jason Hartman. I personally listen to his Creating Wealth real estate investing podcast, and he has over 1,459 episodes. So we're talking someone who has brute force tested. And then in the pre-call, I found out that he has 20 others that he is involved with. He either started and now has guest hosts on. So there's a real lot of podcasting experience here, and he has some great tips. Some of it is in line with what we talk about here, but some of it is just really new perspective on how you should look at your podcast and your show. So I know you're going to really enjoy this. So let me tell you a little bit more about Jason. He's been involved in several thousand real estate transactions, has owned income properties in 11 states and 17 cities. His company is Platinum Properties Investment Network, and he helps people achieve the dream of the American dream of financial freedom by purchasing income property. He has the podcasts, educational events, referrals, mentoring, software, track your investments. Investors can easily locate, finance, and purchase properties in exceptional markets. He has just a whole slew of resources for people at his website. We're going to link to that, of course, in the blog post for this episode, so you'll be able to connect up with him and find out more. But you are not going to want to miss this episode. He has started a media company. So he has Hartman Media Company, and he also has a foundation. Jason started with little. He started while in college at the age of 19, embarking on a career in real estate. So he is a scrappy go-getter, knows how to put it together. And, that's exactly how he got started. I am really impressed with the style of this show, and I think you will be too. I'm impressed because it takes in so many things. Like, he's instinctually done so many things because of how he is and how he investigates the world, that you're really going to hear here that I think is a common thread between many of the successful podcasters I've talked to. So I think you want to listen for that. So you want to check out a show and listen to advice and hear why he's got this thread going that makes his show bingeable and appealing to listeners. So let's go to Jason Hartman. Jason, thanks for joining me today. You are quite the prolific podcaster. Your Creating Wealth and Real Estate Investing podcast has 1,459 episodes as of today that we're recording this. So 5.5+ years, 5 days a week. And then you just told me you have a whole list of other podcasts. So how do you do it?
Well, I have a lot of what I call business hobbies. and being a really curious person, Tracy, one of the things, so I started my first show, the Creating Wealth show, which is still my main show, back in 2006. And I didn't always publish 5 days a week. The original intent was like 1 day a week. And, sadly, I made many mistakes over the years. And there were times when I published irregularly and didn't publish an episode for 3 weeks at a time, okay? But for many years now, we've been very consistent, publishing, 3 to 5 episodes per week. For a while during the pandemic crisis, we were actually publishing 7 days a week because there was so much news. That's my main show, my Creating Wealth show. That's on real estate investing. And I had a lot of success with that show. And so back in about 2008 or 9, I think it was, I started a few other shows, and those worked pretty nicely and took off pretty nicely. And then since then, I've even started more shows. And one of the things I've discovered that podcasting is great for, and this is going to sound pretty odd. Okay, so get ready. This is
maybe not to me. I probably heard it, but go ahead. I can't wait.
You may not have heard this one, except from our mutual friend, Matt. You may have heard it from him. Okay, because he talks about this a lot. But nowadays, when I want to learn something, and I'm a very curious person, as probably many people listening are, when I want to learn something, I'll start a podcast on that topic.
Nope, that's not crazy at all. That's exactly why I have a podcast on blockchain, and I'm not an expert.
Yeah, exactly. And you get to interview a lot of the thought leaders and the industry leaders, and you get to learn from them. I mean, think about it. As podcasters, we don't have to be the subject matter experts. Our guests do, right? So they're the ones that need to impart their brilliance. All we need to do is learn how to be good interviewers, to listen well, to ask good questions, and to draw them out and get them to be candid with us. That's really what we do as the interviewer for our audience. And of course, I'm always on both sides of that coin. Like now you're interviewing me. And so I've been on both
You got to
sides.
be on the other side sometimes too, right? Well, did you start out as a great interviewer? Or, I mean, you've done thousands of episodes, so, you get into this place where you're obviously really good at it now, but did you start out that way?
I don't know. I've always been pretty good as a conversationalist, I think. I've always just been very curious. And, most of my shows are centered around personal finance and investing, real estate investing specifically. And I really like talking about these sort of geeky subjects when it comes to economics. And so I just like talking about it. I mean, I do it for free, but it's nice to earn a lot of money doing it too. So.
Right. Well, how did podcasting come into your mind? It's like, this is the thing I'm going to try. This is the thing I'm going to do.
Good question. And I remember the exact moment I first ever heard the word podcast. It was sometime in 2005. I used to live in Orange County, California.
We lived in the same town, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's great.
I discovered that we're in Irvine. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I lived in Irvine and Newport Coast. I moved around in those areas. And I was driving on a Saturday afternoon on Jamboree Road in Newport Beach.
Yep.
And I was listening to Leo Laporte, the tech guy, on KFI AM Talk Radio. And one of his listeners called in. He'd answer tech questions. And one of his listeners called in and asked about podcasting. And at the time, I had this girlfriend, and she was really like an Apple cult member. And she loved her iPod more than anything in the world. And, that's when it was a big deal to kind of, have an iPod, right? And now it's no big deal, of course. But back then, iPods were sort of just starting to be like this huge rage. And she just loved her iPod. And when someone said podcast, I connected the two naturally, although they're not really connected. And so my ears perked up. And at the time, I had a little radio show on KRLA AM Talk Radio.
Yeah.
And I would do that show every Saturday, a terrestrial radio show. And it was on real estate investing. And, listeners would call in, ask questions and stuff. And it was never very successful. But I did learn a little bit about broadcasting and stuff then. And I had done a book tour about 5 years earlier for my first book. And I did hundreds of radio interviews being the guest. And, I remember I used to get up at 3 a.m. at my home in Newport Coast, and I would do 6 a.m. East Coast Drive, which was a really popular primetime spot to be on the radio.
That's right. Really early, but really prime time. So
yeah. And these radio talk show hosts would interview me about my book called Become the Brand of Choice. It was about personal branding. And so, I guess I learned some interview techniques maybe from them. But yeah, that's kind of how it evolved.
I love that. You have a really interesting show because there's a large portion at the beginning that is you really talking about and setting up the interview that you're going to do, right, where it's a lot of your thought process. That's what you're giving us, is your thought process into things. You're not really, it's not like it's a lesson, which a lot of shows are. It's more of, here's this something to ponder and something to think about. And there's lessons in there, but then you go, and then it really seamlessly ties to your interview. So how do you plan that? Do you do the interview and then do that after? Like, what is your process there? Because it seems seamless.
Yeah. Well, the real answer is, my audience has, they say they love my tangents. And, we have a thing among my listener community called tangent alert. Oh, Jason's going off on another tangent. And frankly, that's just a result of my poor planning. Okay. I don't really plan the shows at all. In fact, many times I'm extremely busy. For example, for today's episode, I know who the guest is because I pre-recorded that interview, but I did not record my monologue portion. And by the way, so I'll just do that off the cuff, probably after this interview, after my next phone call after this, actually. And one of the things I think most podcasters do is I kind of think they take the easy way out a bit, which is they just do interviews, meaning all the content is really generated by the guest. And I do think one of the things my listeners like is they like my monologues and they like the shows where there's no guest, where I just talk myself. Okay. And that really helps the listeners know you better. And it also, hopefully at first helps you develop your own content and your own philosophy. But after you've done that, and that's an ongoing process, so it's never finished. Okay.
Right.
But after you've done that, it also helps you impart your philosophy to your listeners, to your audience. And, look, there's lots of shows where people just interview people, right?
Yeah.
But really, you got interested in podcasting for some reason, right? And it probably wasn't just to interview a bunch of random people, okay? It was to impart your ideas to the world. And yes, you can subtly do that in an interview because you get to talk a little bit too, but you're never really going to do it unless you're doing monologues.
As a part of it. Yeah. And that's the number one advice I do give my clients when they're looking at their podcast is like, after a while, I was like, why aren't you doing solo shows? Why aren't you, doing longer intros or, so that you have a monologue at the beginning? Why aren't you doing that? Because it is the thing most listeners ask for.
Sure. Absolutely.
They want more of you. So you have a very in-depth kind of way of talking throughout there's lots of economic terms and other things that you've obviously talked to over time. So you don't like redefine everything in every episode. So your longtime listeners, I'm sure, know your things, right? Sure. But what it really comes across is you're very informed about what's going on today. What happened in the markets today, what's going on in certain real estate economies in certain states and other places. How do you have time to record all the shows and stay so informed?
Well, that's a challenge. There's no question. I don't really watch TV news or anything. I try to get all of my content commercial free. So, you're not, because if you listen to terrestrial radio or television, it's basically like 18 minutes per hour of commercials. So you're losing a third of the time. So that's the first part about being efficient, right? And, but a lot of the news I just get from reading email newsletters, also just from my guests, from my other interviews. So it builds upon itself. Okay, so that's a nice thing for your own efficiency. When you're interviewing people all the time, you learn from them, you assimilate what they say, and then you teach it back to your audience in a different show, in a different episode, right?
Right. So, yeah. I love that building of knowledge too. So I can see why that's really a success strategy for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And by the way, I'll give you something that's kind of interesting that your listeners might be interested in. And, one of the ideas I think every podcaster in your audience should try and use is create the information once, create the content once, but repurpose it as many ways as possible. So for example, if you like to write, have maybe a professional voiceover actor read your blog posts or read your newsletters, and then you can play them on your podcast. You can do it in your own voice, of course, but it's kind of nice, I think, for the listener if they hear multiple voices on your show, and especially if they're the opposite gender of you, okay? So like the intro to my main show is a female, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of my guests are male because, hey, finances, males are just more interested in that. And we struggle to get more women on the show, and we do get some, but
Well, I've got a great one. I just already made a note for you. I've had her on the Binge Factor. She's incredible. Veronica Dagger of the Wall Street Journal. She writes about,
Awesome.
and she's got a great podcast on women and wealth. So I know
I
she's going to
love
make
it.
a great guest for you.
Yeah.
So,
And-
that's how we
and-
need to connect that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And for my Women Investing Network show, we have a show called The WIN Show, Women Investing Network, and our mutual friend Sharon Lechter of Rich Dad, Poor Dad fame, Robert Kiyosaki, she co-authored books with him. She is guest hosting that show. I'm proud
Which
to
is
say.
a great idea. I love the guest host model. I've started a couple of shows where we had co-hosts, and then I basically turned it over to them after I transferred the authority. So,
Right,
and then I
right.
occasionally pop in, just for fun.
And by the way, I recommend that you not say to another podcaster or another person that they're going to be your co-host. I recommend you say, hey, would you like to guest host some episodes? Because then there's no commitment, right? If they're terrible, you can kick them out, right? and if you introduce them as a guest host, the audience won't mind if they never hear from them again. They won't think, oh, the show is so inconsistent, so I'd call
Johnny Carson, Jay Leno transfer kind of thing. Yeah, guest host for a really long time. Let's make sure the audience likes you before we go in.
Absolutely.
I love that. That's great.
Make sure they're going to stick around too. Absolutely.
So I just want to go.
Hey, Tracy, let me finish one thing. Sure. I want to say. I want to make sure your listeners hear this. So one other unique idea is, right? So create and repurpose content. Okay, and I think a voiceover actor is a good way to do that, because you can. If those are small pieces, like if they're a blog post, they might only be like 5 or 8 minutes long when they're read, okay? And if they're read by someone else, and you do a monologue in that show, and say it's a half-hour show, in the middle of it, you put 5 or 8 minutes and say, hey, I've got one of our blog posts, and we just like you to hear this little lesson on some topic. And it kind of splits the show up. I think it makes it a little more interesting for the listener. Look at it like, instead of being a book, it's a magazine, right? In a magazine, you turn the pages, you got different articles, you got different authors, different ads, different pictures. And I think that's a little more interesting for the listener. That's
I love that. Now you're stylizing your show. That's great.
Yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to say in terms of repurposing content is a couple of years ago, I started a new show called Jason Hartman in the Hot Seat. Okay. And I thought, I'm spending all this time being interviewed by other people like Tracy Hazzard. Okay. and you know what? That's great. It's good that they aired it on their show and their audience heard from me. But what if I could do them a favor and drive some traffic back their way and also get more listenership myself? So I started this new show where I only replay interviews that other people, when they interview me, on the Hot Seat show. Okay.
That's awesome. And we do like some best of reels, and we actually put it into a whole feed of its own. So it's very similar. I love that idea. It's a great idea, and it works really well for you, by the way. Don't forget to put it in your press page, everyone.
Stuff. Yeah.
That's a great, I love the title, In the Hot Seat. That's a great way to do it.
Seat, and there's like the iTunes logo is like, a bunch of microphones
pointed at your face.
So,
I love that. That's really great.
Any comment, no comment.
No comment. Yeah, no comment. I love that. Well, before I get into the binge factor portion of this, which I really want to do, I just want to get your advice, because you've already given us some great tips here. What I want to do is get the best ways. So we're going to go over our 5 best ways. The 5 best ways. So start with booking great guests, which you have some incredible guests, and I'm guessing you didn't just like cold call them.
Right. Yeah. Well, a little bit, definitely. So basically, my show was mostly a monologue show until about episode number 70 or so, 60 or 70. And my problem was I was kind of running out of things to talk about. And so I thought, I got to start getting some guests on the show. And I had held, when I lived in Newport Coast, I held a fundraiser for, and this is not political, okay, because I know some people don't like them, but that's politics, okay. But a friend of mine was connected with this person's campaign that I'm about to mention, and he was running for president, and it's Pat Buchanan. And so I volunteered my home. I had a big, nice home in Newport Coast, nice area. And I volunteered my home for Pat Buchanan to have a fundraiser. So he came, spoke, and, people had to pay like $100 to come, and, and we had appetizers and took pictures and all that good stuff. But, years later, I thought, okay, I need some guests for my shows. He'd be a pretty good one. He's on TV all the time. He's famous, and he's written a bunch of books. And so we reached out to him, and, he kind of owed me a favor.
Yeah.
So he came on the show. He did a great episode. And right after that, I got Harry Dent, another big economist that I've been following for years. He's been on the show now 10 times, Harry Dent has, over the years. And then, when you get a couple of these big name guests, in a certain field, they're all peers. They know each other, okay? They're maybe competitors or colleagues, peers, whatever. And so you can get more because you have social proof, okay?
Yeah. Well, the fact that you have repeat guests says a lot to a prospective guest. Because you wouldn't go back on a show that sucked, right? You just wouldn't do it.
Yeah. And some people probably wouldn't come back because sometimes I grill them a bit. And
that's okay. That's okay. Well, that's great. How do you increase listeners?
Let me mention one more thing about that. On the grilling your guest, okay? Here's another flaw I see that a lot of podcasters have, okay? They think that their customer, if you will, is the guest. And that's not true. Your customer is the audience, and you are the agent of the audience. The audience has agreed to give you their most valuable resource, time. Okay? You've got to protect their time. So don't just accept any guest. If a guest interview is terrible, don't run it. Just throw it in the trash. Okay? And don't let the guests get away with a bunch of self-promotion and a bunch of, like no content. Some guests I've interviewed, I'm like, where's the beef?
It's like the same sound bites as everybody else.
I'm just not going to run that show. And interestingly, some of the more famous guests are the worst.
I keep saying that here on the show, and nobody has believed me. So I'm glad you're repeating that, because I've had that happen to me.
Yeah, I had Brian Tracy on. And, I like Brian Tracy.
He's a great writer. Yeah.
But, he was just total self-promoter. It was actually a crappy episode. I didn't like it. I did run it because he was famous. So I guess I sold out a little bit. But that's one thing, I've heard Tony Robbins interviewed on other shows, and he's just self-promoting.
So this is one of the things, great authors, good authors, ones that I really like that write really well. And some really great speakers are terrible guests.
Yeah.
And that just happens. Well, you were talking about being an agent of the audience, and I love that term. That's a really great way. We always put an audience first model. We're always talking about that here on the show, because we want to increase listeners. And if you don't have a great show, you're not going to increase listeners. Do you have a concerted effort? Do you have anything you do in marketing to help yourself increase listeners, or do you just let it happen organically?
I have not found the holy grail to marketing a podcast.
You're not alone. Just letting you know that.
Okay. Well, I was hoping you could teach me how, because
we're working on it.
But the world of podcasting is pretty organic. I have dabbled. I've tried advertising a little bit. I've tried advertising on other podcasts. None of it has worked very well for me. Maybe it's worked for somebody, but it hasn't worked for me. So it's pretty organic. You just kind of need to get found. Just keep doing a good job. Podcasting is not for impatient people. Okay. This is a long game strategy here. And, even my audience is not that big. Okay. I've got a highly engaged audience that has made me many millions of dollars. Okay. That's been great. But, first off, a lot of podcasters just flat out lie about their audience size. They're just lying. Okay. And they Twitter bomb, and, I don't need to mention names, but hopefully, who they are.
Yeah.
Okay. And they're just lying, okay, about their audience size. But many podcasters do have really big audiences. But the question is, how much money are they making? How much engagement are they getting out of that audience? A lot of times, your audience is big, but it's not doing much.
Engagement goes down over a certain size. We see it consistently. So you're so right there. How do you produce in a professional way? I know you have a team. So
Yeah, I've always had a producer. I don't know how to do audio editing. I'd like to know how, because I could do more micro editing and stuff. But I've always had a producer, and I just record and put the episode in a Dropbox folder, and they pick it up and do the editing.
nice. How do you encourage engagement in your audience?
We have not been great at this, but when we've done it, it's worked. And that, I think contests are good, especially if you do. One of my team members, Brittany, who's been with us about 12 years, she would always do just a couple of cute little things on our web forums. So, for example, people would go to jasonhartman.com/contest. Okay, and by the way, I think you can go there and see
there's something there, yeah.
but you can see what we've done. And so what she would do is she'd have the typical thing. Okay, enter the contest to win, the Apple AirPods, or, a Ring doorbell, or, whatever. We'd just do a giveaway like that. Okay. And they would go there and, the typical thing, name, phone number, email address, right? But she would always put in a couple of cute little things, like 2 questions. And we wouldn't require answers, but most people would answer them. And it would be like, what questions or comments do you have for Jason? Tell us what you love about the Creating Wealth show. And first off, you'd get great content, because all those questions you can answer on your show, okay? And then also you'd get great testimonials as well.
Yeah,
so that's minor little hack, big results. Yeah.
That's great. Monetization. You mentioned earlier that you're not a big fan of listening to content with ads. I noticed there's not really any ads in your show that I heard in the few that I listened to, but
that's my own fault. Okay. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be any ads. I just think that radio and TV have way too many ads. It's like you get so little content per hour, it's ridiculous.
Well, and they seem very irrelevant. So that's probably more the case. Like they seem too many because it's not relevant to you.
Right. That's the shotgun advertising. Whereas on a podcast, if you screen your advertisers, you can get targeted advertising that your listeners probably want to hear. Okay. People always want to find good products and services, right? So
absolutely.
And the reason you don't hear ads on my podcast is just because we haven't really made any effort at selling advertising, which is our own fault. Okay, so
yeah, but so how do you look at it as a return on investment then?
But the return on investment for the show is my main show, the Creating Wealth Show, is really a show that was always geared toward getting clients who are real estate investors. And, we've made many millions of dollars on just that strategy alone. We've sold some educational products. We, back when we had live conferences, which sadly we can't do at the moment while we're recording this, we would sell tickets to our live conferences, and that made us quite a bit of money. Educational products, live conferences, but mostly literally selling properties to investors. That was far and away the most lucrative part of our strategy.
Wonderful. So do you think you have a bingeable show?
Well, people say I do. I've many times I've heard this over the years, Tracy, where someone will say, maybe they're at one of our live conferences, or they'll just reach out through the website or something, and say that, I discovered your show 2 months ago, and I've driven my wife crazy because all I do is listen to you, and I've gone backwards and I've listened to your entire back catalog, which now is pretty hard to do.
I would think that's pretty hard to do.
It really is. And some people say, they listen 2 or 3 times to every episode. I mean, I'm flattered that it's that interesting, but
well, do you have any idea why?
Well, I think it's some of the stuff we talked about already. It's the quality of the guests, the quality of the interview, the fact that it's not all guests, the fact that you do mix it up a little bit and have like magazine style. So I think all of those factors, you know.
Yeah. So I always give everybody my opinion because I evaluate hundreds of shows.
Right.
So my view on it is that what I see as a consistent factor across shows that I absolutely know are bingeable is that you have an in-depth show. There's nothing dumbed down here in what you do. You're talking about, broader economic topics. You're touching on things that maybe people don't know about, but instead of doing the like 101 explanation of everything, you make sure it's defined enough that it's understandable, but you give them resources, places to go find that, and it makes the listener want to bring themselves up to the level. And I
Right.
think
Yeah,
that gives you an aspirational show, right? I want to
yeah.
be as good as you, or I want to be as informed as you. And
Mhm.
so you're my go-to information, help me be that informed in what I'm doing on a daily basis. So you don't want to miss out once you're in that place.
That's a good point, Tracy. Thank you for that. And one more thing I'd put in there. Some podcasts I listen to, I don't know. I'm sure there's a market for it, but I'm too type A and too impatient. I just don't like it when two people are just chit chatting. That just bores me. I'm like, get to the point. You
Let's just
know,
talk about the topics. Let's get into it. Absolutely.
seriously, it's like, oh, what did you do last weekend? Well, I don't know. We did, seriously, like, I don't, I don't know. I don't think anybody cares, but maybe
Well,
apparently they do because.
yeah. Well, before we go, do you have any advice for aspiring podcasters out there or existing ones who really need to up their game?
Yeah, I'd say that, look, if you're going to get into the world of podcasting and maybe you're from the world of internet marketing, for example, or direct response marketing of any sort, this is not fast. This is a slow, long-term strategy. You've got to be very consistent about it. You better plan to be consistent and stick with it. Many people give up too early. And the other thing I'd say is don't look at your numbers or agonize about your numbers. Okay. If I was holding a conference, think of it this way, and I invited you to give a speech, and of course you have something to promote behind that, right? You sell properties or you have a financial newsletter or whatever it is, right? If I told you I'm going to have 100 people at this conference and you can come and give a half-hour speech, you'd probably say yes. That would be a good promotional opportunity for you. Well, if you have an audience of 100 people that will listen to you and listen to you consistently, that's gold.
It is.
Okay. If you can get that audience up to 500 or 1,000, you're going to be at the bottom of the podcast pyramid. Those numbers are tiny in the world of podcasting, but you can make a ton of money off 1,000 people. Okay.
Yeah.
So just, I don't look at my numbers very much. I don't agonize about my numbers. I really don't think about them too much. I just know.
I try to get people not to.
Yeah, I agree with you. I just know that we get a lot of clients from the show. They're making money and it's all good. So,
well, Jason, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your insights into extreme podcasting, as I'm going to call it. And what I really liked is that last bit of advice was showing that, you really have this viewpoint of a long-term investment in podcasting, which must go along great with the investment strategies you're advising all the time anyway.
It does parallel. Yes.
Well, thanks again.
All right. Thank you, Tracy, and happy podcasting.
So I don't know about you, but I have got a whole slew of notes here. I mean, there's just so many good nuggets of information and ideas to try. I love the idea of the contest and adding in a couple of extra questions. Sometimes we do it anyway, but it never dawned on me that we could do it in a way to get the feedback and get testimonials back. We do it because of bots and other things. So now that really makes a lot of sense. You can really see how he's really cultivating his brand in a way that makes you want to choose him. And that's why when he said that his first book was called Become the Brand Choice, I'm like, that just makes complete sense to me. It absolutely is in line with everything that he's done and everything that he's about. And I love the depth at which he goes to. The other thing that I completely agree with and have found for myself, and maybe it's the way my mind works and the way Jason's mind works, and maybe it's the way your mind works too. But I have found that being able to look at your podcast as an exploration, as an experiment, as an opportunity. And when you look at it from that perspective, the interviews are less stressful, everything flows, everything's easier. And but when you put that and add to that mix, being an agent of the audience as he talked to, now you have the magic. So you have great curiosity and interest in things. You have being a cultivator and a curator for your audience and being careful about what you put in front of them to make sure that they get value and caring about that value. And you add to that this unwillingness to compromise. Like, why should I have to do a dumbed down show? Why should I have to do it simple? Let's do this in a way that puts the right people at the right level in as my audience and draws them in and excites them. And if it's 200 people or 20,000 people, what does it matter? So I love Jason's advice, and I'm so glad I was able to get him on the Binge Factor. And this happened from this really great group I got connected to. So I want to give them a little shout out. Mike Calhoun and a board of advisors, incredible group. And I'm just so amazed at the mentorship group and mastermind that they put together. And that's how I met Jason. So really impressive to think about that, like one quick meeting and all of a sudden you have an interview that inspires you and gets you going, right? Think about that when you're reaching out there and asking for guests. It was really simple. I had 15 minutes and at the end of it, he messaged me something and I immediately messaged back and said, "Oh, I hear you're a podcaster. I'd love to have you on my show," right? Done. So think about that too, is that there's a power in that connection where I knew the interest, I knew the caliber of the group, I knew he was going to make a great guest. I had no idea he was going to be such a great guest, but that's where wonderful surprises and where I get to learn in this whole process and where I get to get excited about what I'm going to bring you next. So I'll have connections to not all of Jason's shows because he's got so many, but I'll have connections to Hartman Media. I'll have connections to Creating Wealth. I'll have connections to how to find Jason everywhere on social media and on the internet. I'll have that in the blog post for this episode at thebingefactor.com. So thanks again for listening, everyone. I hope you're getting as much nuggets of knowledge that you're applying into your show and that you're actually using some of this advice and trying it out. If you are, I'd love to hear back from you. So reach out to me on social media. You can reach out anywhere at Has Design, at Feed Your Brand, either one of those. And just let me know what you're thinking. I'd love to know when you've applied something and had a success factor too. And who knows, maybe you'll be my next guest on the Binge Factor.
You've been listening to the Binge Factor podcast. For more information on podcasting and videocasting success tips and tactics, please go to thebingefactor.com. And be sure to listen to our other show for podcasters called Feed Your Brand. If you'd like to be interviewed on this show, as well as featured in Tracy's column, please go to thebingefactor.com/guest and apply.